This isn't a common technique on clothing, but I do this quite a bit on sci-fi costumes. Fake binding isn't really something you plan on doing, it's more of a solution to a design problem. So here's how to make fake binding without using bias strips. Here's my pretend pattern piece and fabric cut. It has a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the curve. Normally binding wouldn't have a seam allowance, but this isn't normal binding. Now I'm cutting the piece out again in my binding fabric. There's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I want a 1/2 inch binding plus another 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I need to mark out the fabric at 1.5 inches from the edge and cut it out. Now I'm drawing on the original piece where the seam allowance is. Then I'm marking a 1/2 inch from the inner edge of the binding piece, which will be my stitch line. See how the inner seam allowance of the binding is going to butt up against the line marked on the original piece? Now I'll pin the binding to the original as well as I can without stretching it. I'm sewing just to the right of the stitch line. Depending on how curved the seam is, the seam allowance might have to be snipped or cut away like this one. Now I can press the binding flat. Then I trim away the seam allowance from the original fabric and pin the lining piece on top. Sew the edge at a 1/2 inch, and then snip into the curve so it can turn back without puckering. Then I press it flat with the binding hanging over just a smidge. And there you have a fake binding.